Hello, welcome to Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota in our program Human Rights Forum. I'm Katia. Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota is a nonprofit organization based in the state of Minnesota in the United States. Every third Thursday of every month, we have been hosting a global movies discussion. Tonight, exceptionally, given the current horrible events, we are hosting our Human Rights Forum, where we will discuss the war in Ukraine. If you want to learn more about CGS Minnesota work, please visit our website at www.globalsolutionsmn.org and follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is at CGS_MN, and our Facebook page is Global Solutions MN. We also have a channel in the YouTube, CGS-MN. Ladies and gentlemen, to speak with us tonight, we invited and are honored to host our guest speaker, Thomas Hanson. Thomas is a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer and currently is diplomat in residence at Alworth Institute for International Affairs at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, and has taught diplomacy at Carleton College. He also serves as a chair of the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations and as co-chair of the Minnesota-China Business Council. He is a past board member of the Oslo Center for Peace and Human Rights and director at the Institute for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, IEECA. In his career with the State Department, Hanson's foreign postings included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and Georgia. He also assisted in opening new embassies in Mongolia and Estonia. Hanson has also worked on foreign relations committees of the US Senate and House of Representatives. He was director for NATO and European Affairs at the Atlantic Council of the United States in Washington, D.C. He serves on the St. Paul, Minneapolis Committee on Foreign Relations and as a lecture consultant for the Minnesota International Center. He is an occasional foreign affairs commentator on Minnesota Public Radio and instructor at many area colleges. Hanson graduated from the University of Minnesota with BA in International Relations. He holds graduate degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, the Geneva Institute of Advanced International Studies in Switzerland, and the National School of Administration in Paris, France. Please help me to welcome Thomas Hanson. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you, Katya. Thank you for that very, very kind and long introduction. That's wonderful. And well, thanks so much to Citizens for Global Solutions for organizing this program tonight and for inviting me to speak. Obviously, our topic is a tragic one when it comes to the world of human rights and what we see happening now in Ukraine. It is a barbaric invasion that the Russians have launched. There's absolutely no excuse for this kind of behavior in the international environment. We see the human tragedy unfolding day by day on our news channels. Over 3 million people have fled, high numbers of civilian casualties. This is a human rights disaster. And so, we'll be talking about elements of that for sure. It's very hard to know why the Russians and Vladimir Putin chose this course. They have complaints, which I will describe in my remarks, but this seems to be really, Talleyrand once said of an event in his time as French minister. He said, it was worse than a crime. It was a blunder. And I think Russia has blundered now into a situation that they did not foresee. You could argue that this is maybe the worst decision by a Russian leadership since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, when similarly they totally underestimated an adversary. They had no idea that Japan had strengthened to the extent that it had by that time, and they suffered a humiliating defeat, which led to the 1905 revolution in France, in Russia rather, and then eventually you could argue to the collapse of Tsarism during World War I. So, as I say, it's just very hard to see what the calculation is in Moscow right now. I'm going to approach this topic sort of from two angles. One, this Ukraine crisis is propelling trends that were already surging coming out of the COVID pandemic. It is actually accentuating a number of trends that have human rights implications. And it's also central to a larger geopolitical situation in the world, a geopolitical situation that is in dangerous flux. So it's at the crossroads of all kinds of issues. And for me, one of the great tragedies of what's happening right now is that the world appears to be breaking down into blocks again, just at a time when we're facing shared global threats that threaten humanity. If ever there was a time when we need cooperation globally and a clear threat analysis, setting priorities, it's now. And I just feel things are just gravitating in the wrong direction at present. So I'm going to go share screen here. Hopefully this will all work. I have a number of images that I'll be showing during the presentation. So, as I said, the world is, even before this crisis in Ukraine, was in a perilous situation coming out of COVID. A lot of disruptions. Here we see the Omicron variant with its 37 mutations, and there are signs that there's a subvariant of Omicron now that is taking hold in Europe. We may be talking about it more in just a couple of weeks here. So this has been a disturbingly elusive, dangerous pandemic that has led to all kinds of dislocations in the global economy. We all know about the supply chain issues, the blockages that are ongoing. China, with its zero COVID policy, is locking down right and left, which is also disrupting global supply chains. As a result, we're seeing high inflation. And here again, the Ukraine crisis is only going to increase the inflationary trends, unfortunately. And so these issues were already leading toward a deglobalization, if you will, a move toward a more regional economic structure with supply chains brought closer to home. The idea of resilient supply chains is being embraced by many nations now. So all this is coming to a head as the Ukraine crisis takes place. In addition, this pandemic has gravely worsened the inequality in the world. I consider this degree of inequality that we see today as a serious human rights issue. I think that inequality should be at the top of every human rights organization's agenda, because the human costs of this degree of concentration of wealth are increasing. Here you can see, just since the pandemic broke out, how the ultra high worth individuals have profited doubling and more their already towering wealth. This is the World Bank estimate of the world's most unequal regions, and you can see the Americas do not fare well in this global. You can see here South America, Mexico, but also the United States, high degrees of inequality and getting worse. And so once again, the pandemic has increased these troubling trends in the world. And it's having an unequal impact. It's really hitting the developing world most strongly. Now, these were the projections before the Ukraine crisis in October. And you can see here for the IMF, the hardest hit regions are Latin America. They're going to have the lowest growth. In fact, Latin America has suffered the most from the pandemic. Governments there did not handle it well. They've had probably the highest death rates, but also sub-Saharan Africa. So these are the emerging markets are being buffeted now by supply chain issues, by rising inflation, costs of all kinds, energy costs, and now a strengthening dollar is also going to hit them hard as they try to refinance their debts. So Latin America, as I say, has been hardest hit, and we have a very strong populist trend all through Latin America now, resulting from this. One of the most interesting elections will be in Brazil, where later this year, where two populists will face off, one of the right and one of the left, Bolsonaro and Lula. It will be interesting to see, but this is happening all across the continent of Latin America. Africa, tragically, they, before the pandemic, were the success story in many ways. Highest growth rates in the world were in countries in Africa. Ethiopia had the highest growth rate in 2018, 2019. And these very positive trends now have been reversed. There are signs of instability all across the African country. You can see here the number of coups and conflicts that have broken out just in 2021. The Ethiopian civil war being the worst. And of course, these are human rights disasters that are following from the instability that results from the world economic situation. So all of these human rights developments were there before the Ukraine crisis. And adding to this, the sharp rise in food prices that already in 2021 were taking place. You can see the various commodities that have gone up the most: oils, sugar, that sort of thing. So many people think we're heading toward a new food crisis globally. And here again, the fact that Russia and Ukraine account for 30% of all grain exports in the world, Russia being the number one exporter of grains ahead of us. All of this is coming together in a very unfortunate way. So at the end of last year, the Davos meeting in Davos, Switzerland, of the World Economic Forum is kind of the world elite comes together to celebrate itself, but also to take a look at what's coming in the global economy. And the World Economic Forum always, before each meeting, and they were virtual this year, just like last year, they send out a questionnaire. What are your greatest worries? What are the greatest risks facing the world today? And here are the top 10 global risks that resulted from this World Economic Forum survey. Now, climate and extreme weather, they have been slowly rising in this poll each year. There's some worry about an asset bubble burst, various other things, but most striking this year was the sudden appearance of social issues. The number 3 threat for the global elite is mental health deterioration. And I think they're not talking about their own mental health, but rather the mental health of the societies that they live in. And suddenly that factor has just emerged literally out of nowhere. I know that's a major point in the teachers' strike that's going on right now in Minneapolis. I know at the university, I see this as a growing concern among students. And so interesting that this is actually sort of percolated up to the global elites, economic elites as well. But as you can see, there's no mention of any crisis in Ukraine among the global risks. There's sort of this, and this is like a month before the crisis broke out. So the Ukraine crisis really appeared to many as a black swan, as they say, kind of coming out of the blue. Putin had built up his troops, but nobody really thought he would dare to invade this country of 44 million people. But the pundits were wrong, and so we see these horrendous scenes This is in the city of Mariupol, which is still being bombarded. The city is just being destroyed right along the Black Sea coast there. Tragic. And of course, the numbers of refugees trying to get out via Poland and elsewhere. I just spoke with someone today. It's the United States is promising, in fact, they made some fanfare about this, to accept Ukrainian refugees. And in fact, though, it appears, and this may come out in the press now more, that the United States, in fact, is not going to let Ukrainian refugees into the U.S., that the pipelines are already overflowing because of the Afghan refugees, refugees coming in from Central and Latin America, and that the follow-through for the U.S. accepting refugees may not take place. As a human rights organization, I think it would be good to focus on this and track what's happening here, because I think we, just like every other country, have an obligation not just to say we're going to admit refugees, but actually admit them. And so, as I say, we may be hearing more about this in the media. The Russians, one of the things they didn't expect was the ability of Volodymyr Zelensky to emerge as a national leader. He's somebody whose career had him play a leader of Ukraine in a sitcom, a comedy sitcom. And lo and behold, he became the leader of Ukraine and has been quite brave and relentless in his public messaging. He's been speaking to parliaments in the West. He spoke to our Senate. He spoke to the German Bundestag and others. So he has provided admirable leadership and a lot of courage. So what is on Vladimir Putin's mind? How can one explain what's happened? And as I say, there's no explanation, no defense that I can conceive of for what they've done. But what have been the complaints that Russia has had that led them even to consider something like this? And of course, as we all know from the reporting, it's a long-standing grievance regarding the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization after the Cold War. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 into 15 separate republics, the Warsaw Pact, which had been the other alliance on the other side, was dissolved. But NATO continued, and in a sense, the West had prevailed. So why disband this alliance? And I was quite active myself in those years in these issues. And during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, there was no thought of expanding NATO itself. The idea was, how do we sort of create an architecture for Europe at the end of the Cold War? And there was something called Partnership for Peace, which I was quite active in for a number of years. And it was an outreach program based in NATO to all of the former countries of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union to associate on an equal basis with NATO, with the idea of strengthening these ties. And Russia was included. But in 1994, for whatever reasons, and we can discuss that, Bill Clinton decided that it would make more sense to begin expanding NATO. It was quite controversial at the time. I recall our Secretary of Defense, William Perry, at the time threatened to resign over this decision. But it went forward, and it might have been the right thing to do. If you believe that Russia was going to be back at some point, would never really change, would always be autocratic, then yes, especially the Central and Eastern European countries wanted some protection immediately. And so that was the road that was taken. But already in 1994, Boris Yeltsin complained to Clinton about this, saying that this Russia cannot accept this. And he told Clinton, "We're too weak now. We can't do anything about this. But in the future, you may face a Russia that can do something about this." So it's kind of a warning right at the beginning. And Gorbachev has also been highly critical of NATO expansion. So although Putin is a troubling figure, he's not the only one. He's not the only Russian leader or since the 90s who has complained about this. So as you can see in the upper right, there have been waves of expansion. The first one coming in 1999. As I say, the decision was taken in 94, but it took until 99 to actually begin the expansion. But then the big one, the really big one, was in 2004, as you can see here. And that's where Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, and most importantly, the Baltic states, all of them former Soviet republics, right next to St. Petersburg, came into NATO. Now, at that time, Putin had been the president of Russia for 4 years, and he accepted this very grudgingly, but he accepted this wave of expansion. But from that time on, 2004, the Russians have been saying no further. They put down red lines, especially regarding Ukraine and Georgia. And of course, there were crises there in 2008 in Georgia, when the Russians seized 2 republics of Georgia, and of course then in 2014 already in Ukraine. So this is the basic issue. And so when Russia began amassing troops and put down their red lines, it was all about NATO and the US agreeing to no further eastward expansion of NATO. You can see there that Ukraine and Belarus come right up to Russia. They basically are asking for a sphere of influence de facto in this region. And NATO is not inclined to think in those terms. For the US and for NATO, Ukraine is a sovereign nation under the UN, and it can make a sovereign choice of its foreign policy, which direction it wants to go. And if Ukraine wants to join NATO, then the door is open. And that principle takes precedence over any thought of a sphere of influence kind of a world, which is the way Russia thinks, unfortunately. Now, the complicating factor in all this is that Ukraine is a very complicated country. It's been a country only for brief periods of its history. The eastern part, which is Russian speaking, as you can see here in the green, the degree of how many residents speak Russian, has always been closest to Russia. But the west, really from the central part west of Kiev and then over especially to Lviv, that part of Russia has been, of Ukraine rather, has been part of the Habsburg Empire, part of Polish empires in the past. The religion there is the Uniate faith, which is a form of Catholicism. They look to the Pope. And so there are linguistic, historical, and religious divisions between these parts of Ukraine. It makes it a hard country, and actually a country that should not be asked to choose. And you can see here the voting patterns. This was the 2010 election where Yanukovych, the pro-Russia candidate, got the votes in blue. You can see most of eastern Ukraine voted for the pro-Russian candidate. And when you get over to the west, especially around Lviv, it was overwhelmingly for the pro-Western candidate, in that case, Yulia Tymoshenko. So it's a complicated political geography. So when someone like Putin looks at this, he made a very fateful statement after the 2014 crisis, and you can see it there in the upper right, talking about New Russia, or Novorossiya, which was an old Tsarist term. And he said, these territories were given to Ukraine in the 1920s by the Soviet government. Why? God knows. This is a quote from Putin. Putin hates the legacy of Lenin. He is highly critical of the Soviet period for having, in other words, the idea that he would want to restore the Soviet Union is off the mark. He thinks more in 19th century terms of Russia. And of course, for him, the Ukraine is a bit of a heartland of Russian culture and religion, which is the problem here. And so with this idea of Novorossiya, you can see that's exactly what is happening now with the invasion. I mean, there are signs that Russia is trying to secure what they would call Novorossiya, the Russian-speaking areas. This allows them to have a land bridge to Crimea, to keep Crimea from being cut off by water. And what has surprised a lot of people is that they are going so hard against the capital, Kiev, because that is a very risky, obviously, thing to do. It'd be one thing to try to just seize the eastern part and just stop there. But here, it's really a full assault on Ukraine. Very hard to understand. And once again, this is for great Russian nationalists, and there are a lot of them in Russia. Think more of old Russia than of the Soviet period. Yes, the area around Kiev was the Kievan Rus was basically the foundation of what's considered the Russian state in the 11th century, and the Russian Orthodox Church began in Kiev. Putin is reportedly religious. Nobody really knows. He's a bit of a cipher, but the idea is that he is, in fact, a devout Orthodox. Nobody knows for sure. One thing for sure is that he depends on the support of the Russian Orthodox Church to a very large degree, because older Russians still rever the church, and so Putin's still 70% support, even in the context of this invasion, are largely from older Russians, some of them devout. So the church support is essential to him. And the Russian Orthodox Church is still angry that a couple of years ago, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church broke off, set up a separate church from the Russian one. And so the church would like to reincorporate the Ukrainian Orthodox Church if it could. So all of these things are at play in what's going on. Now, the resistance to this ill-fated decision by Putin, whatever his motives, has been far stronger than the Russians anticipated. It's based on several weapon systems that have been provided to the Ukrainians by NATO. Actually, even though they're not a NATO member, there's been some cooperation. I think the Russians underestimated the degree to which the Ukrainian army had mastered these systems. The first being the Stinger missile, which can knock out tanks. This was a very important weapon in the Afghan war, when the Soviets were controlling Afghanistan. And maybe even more important, Bayraktar drones. Now, these are fairly inexpensive drones provided by the Turks. This is a problem in Turkish-Russian relations right now. They are doing great damage to the Russian forces. In fact, Ukrainian women are starting to name their children Bayraktar after this. It's a Turkish name. The Ukrainians had announced before the invasion that they were going to set up an independent national production facility of these drones. So these have been very important in keeping the Russians at bay. The other thing is the fact that NATO is, in the U.S., channeling more and more weapons into Ukraine via Poland, via Lviv there, and I'm sure you've all read about the massive strike against this International Peacekeeping and Security Center on the far left. That strike was from a high-flying Russian bomber over Russian territory that launched an airborne cruise missile. This is the problem with the no-fly zone that Zelensky is insisting upon. It would be symbolically good, but it would not change much on the ground, because the Russians are not using fixed-wing aircraft over Ukraine for any of this. They're using ground-based missiles, and they're using, as I say, airborne cruise missiles from Russia. Now, the other factor here is a human factor. The young Russians who are being captured seem highly demoralized, and it makes one think of a very famous scene in Tolstoy's War and Peace, where on the eve of the fateful Battle of Borodino against Napoleon, Tolstoy depicts a winter ball that's going on in spite of all the conflict, and Prince Andrei is asked, who will win the battle tomorrow against Napoleon? And he says, what will decide the victory will be what each man feels in his own heart on each side. And I think that for a lot of Russian recruits, their heart is not in it. They are having to fight against people that are their brethren, if you will. And many Russians feel that historically Russians fight fiercely to defend their homeland. They are unmatched fighters, but they do not do well outside of their own territory. And there may be some of that at work here. So that human factor, I think, is actually fairly significant, and I think it's a tragedy for many of these young Russian soldiers who are having to do this. Maybe as a result, Putin has announced that they're going to bring in outside fighters. This is Razan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen forces, which are quite fierce fighters. Putin was able to stop the Muslim uprising in Chechnya with very drastic measures. And so these forces now are coming in. Apparently Kadyrov is in Ukraine now, may be asked to do things that will be human rights tragedies. And then they're bringing in about 20,000 battle-hardened Syrian soldiers. The Russians have supported Assad all along, and I think that this is an example where Assad says, okay, you helped us, we will help you. So, there are foreign fighters coming in from the West to help the Ukrainians too, and this is the danger of this war settling in and becoming broader, even as we speak. So Putin, by all accounts, is somewhat isolated right now. He has been a real germaphobe during the lockdown, taking extreme measures to avoid being exposed to COVID. And COVID has raged in Russia. It's still a bad outbreak in Russia. Their vaccine was not as effective as they had hoped. So it's a weakened country that way that is launching this invasion. And so even meeting with his own advisors, he takes this sort of long approach. Now, people talk about how the oligarchs, who are being losing their wealth and their yachts right now, might be able to turn against Putin somehow. But the oligarchs count for really nothing in Russia. They have their wealth at the behest of the government. The key sort of formation of the government is among what they call the Siloviki, who are the old KGB, now called FSB, and military intelligence people who have stayed together and in the late 90s basically took over. It was the last vestige of power in Russia because the party had been basically disbanded. And so these Siloviki, and Putin is their figurehead, are in charge. And they show no signs of altering course. So here you see Putin with Foreign Minister Lavrov and Defense Minister Shoigu, who is heading up the invasion. Other key figures include this fellow, Nikolai Patrushev, who is the head of the National Security Council. He is more radical than Putin, at least based on his public pronouncements. And if Putin were to fall, the danger would be that someone like Patrushev would come in, because that would actually be let's put it mildly, it would not be an improvement on the situation. One of the most powerful is this gentleman here, Igor Sechin, who is a Siloviki, former deputy prime minister. Now, he has also, in the meantime, taken over Rosneft. So to that extent, he's an oligarch as well, but his basis is in the old security services. It's very much like what you have in, say, Pakistan, with the ISI, which is the state within the state, made up of the security forces who actually run Pakistan. It's becoming the same way, or is the same way in Russia. Without knowing it, the French stumbled upon Sechin's yacht a couple of weeks ago in La Ciotat on the Mediterranean, and confiscated it, and that's happening all around the world. Finally, at long last, the craven, and I'll use that word again, craven British, who have allowed London to become the playground of Russian oligarchs. A lot of Brits in the financial sector, real estate, have made a lot of money on this ill-gotten wealth coming out of the East. And they have never been willing to cut. They're making too much money in Britain on this. Finally, in this situation, they're cracking down on what they call Londongrad. And it can't happen soon enough. This is the largest private residence in London, and it's owned by a Russian fertilizer czar, of all things. So in any event, these are big developments taking place as a result of the crisis. Now, I'm just going to pause for a moment on this fellow because I think it reflects the outlook of the Siloviki, how they're viewing the world right now. And this is, as I say, Sergei Karaganov, by the way, I'm hearing some ding. Is everything okay over there? So make sure that I'm still coming through here. There's some,
Yes.
okay, just because there's this occasional ringing sound. I'm not sure what that is, but okay. So, in any event, Carragon, I actually knew him in the 90s when I was at the Atlantic Council. He's a long-standing advisor, very influential, and he's been writing articles and giving interviews in Russian for the last months, saying roughly the following. The West blew its chance in the 1990s. It had a chance to integrate Russia. That would have been very timely for the West, because now that China has risen, it would have been nice to have Russia on the side of the West looking out at China. But the West blew it by expanding NATO. And Russia today, he says, has no interest in Europe. He says that Europe has become a meaningless concept. Leadership there is divided and useless. In fact, Russia is ready to slam the door on the West. He says that hundreds of years of history are coming to an end during which Russia aspired to be part of Europe. He said that is over. Russia's future lies to the east in Greater Eurasia, as Northern Eurasia, as he calls it, in close partnership with China and with countries like Iran and potentially Turkey. So he writes that Russia must be prepared for a period of total rupture from the West, a period that may last up to a decade. As he says, Russia must be an invulnerable citadel during this period. Now, this was well before the invasion, and it makes you think that the elite in Russia was ready for this barrage of sanctions, ready to be totally pushed away from the West, because that's what they want to do anyway. Whether this is a realistic strategy, God knows. But I think it is part of the risk-taking that we're seeing now. Now, Karganov, Putin, his generation, they are the last products of the old Soviet system, their generation. The young ones coming up in Russia, not at all. They've had a different reality. And you can see here, this was a protest a couple of days after the invasion, before they really cracked down. And you can see this is in, I think, St. Petersburg. The sea of faces, it's mostly young people, as you can see. And that's the whole issue in Russia. Young Russians, to a very large degree, are opposed to this war. In fact, it's estimated that up to 200,000 young Russians have left, just discreetly getting out before the door is slammed. The rumor is that Russia will try to keep citizens from leaving Russia now for this reason. I met two of them over the weekend, two young Russian males, draft age, who quietly got out of Moscow to Armenia. They were in town for an art event, and were going back to Armenia with no intention of ever going back to Russia. And as one of these young men said, I'm 23 years old. This freeze could last for decades. I just can't waste my life being back in Russia. So this is the Russians are losing a lot of their best young people here in this situation. And of course, they are cracking down. If you protest, you could get up to 15 years in prison, is the new law there. So once again, human rights there too. Now, the sanctions have been severe. We all know an unprecedented step only North Korea and Iran have faced sanctions like this, where we literally closed down their central bank. Putin had built up about $600 billion in reserves that they had planned to draw upon in this situation, and we have frozen half of those assets. He has no access to at least $300 billion worth of their reserves. Just as Afghanistan has no access to their reserves, and which, by the way, just as an aside, in terms of human rights, I don't see how the United States really can hold these billions of dollars of Afghan reserves, even though the Taliban are ruling now. I mean, this is money that could be used to avoid starvation and human rights tragedies in Afghanistan. And we purported to be, there for the people of Afghanistan, right? That was the whole idea. Especially for women and their rights. And here we are, to my view, going in just the opposite direction. And we're being attacked by the EU, by the UN on this decision, basically to take a good part of the Afghan reserves and give them to survivors of 9/11 here in the States. I just don't understand it. But anyway, that's an aside. It's another human rights issue. So the ruble has tanked. Russia is saying now that they may pay their foreign debts in rubles. Well, of course, that'll be the same as defaulting if they do that. And of course, now they will be turning to China, which I'll talk about in a minute. So yes, the ruble has plummeted. You can see on the right or in the middle there, the prices of natural gas are soaring. And this will increase inflation around the world. The Europeans are not going along with cutting off Russian oil and gas, and we're not forcing them to. We're cutting it all off and urging everyone to do so. But countries like Italy, Germany, the whole Eurozone are heavily dependent at this stage on Russian oil and gas. The Czech Republic is 100% dependent on that. So the idea is that they will slowly phase out their dependence on Russian oil and gas. We'll see if that really happens. It's not easy. Nord Stream 2, the pipeline has been suspended, but they're not destroying it. I mean, it's suspended. And the idea is that we'll provide liquefied natural gas by sea to Germany, and that they will build ports to accept our LNG. And of course, that'll take time. And here, this is adding to the world food crisis. As prices go up, you can see on the right there how much Ukraine and Russia account for the globally traded wheat and other exports. Now, the other dimension to this, and I'm sure, and there are people in Belgium right now are taking iodine tablets. Apparently, Russia is brandishing the nuclear sword. This is what they call the Iskander missile, which is conventional, but it can also take nuclear warheads, and it can take tactical nuclear warheads. And tactical nuclear weapons have been part of the Russian battle plan now for quite a while. And you can't totally exclude that they would do either they would not use it against NATO, but they could use one of these weapons within Ukraine if the situation get bad enough. At the minimum, a demonstration shot, either into unoccupied territory or over the Black Sea. But Washington's quite worried about any escalation, and that's one reason that the no-fly zone is not being considered. Belarus, which had major demonstrations just months ago, is now fully in the Russian camp, although maybe not the population of Belarus, especially the young population. And this is NATO's big problem now, resulting from this crisis. And it's the weak point of NATO. It's called the Suwalski Gap. And as we're sending more young Americans over to Europe, a good number of them will be going up into this area because Kaliningrad belongs to Russia. There are a lot of Iskander nuclear weapons there. A lot of forces built up in Kaliningrad. And now that Belarus has tipped all the way into the Soviet orbit, and now that Belarus is willing to take Russian nuclear weapons, which they've announced, this is the situation. You can see this Suwalki Gap and its low land could be cut off in a heartbeat, and this would totally isolate the Baltic states by land. And so the Balts are quite concerned about this. So NATO is beefing up ground forces on both sides of the Suwalki Gap right now. Now, what Putin considers his ace in the hole, I guess, is the relationship with China. China-U.S. relations have been getting worse and worse since the Trump era, are at a fairly low point now, and the Russians are more open now than they were before to sort of teaming up with Russia to challenge the U.S. position in the world. And so if you look at the summit that they had on February 4th, where they issued a very long joint statement, which I recommend reading because it's almost like their worldview, including their worldview of human rights and democracy, which is hard to imagine, but I think they proclaimed a worldview on these issues. And the basic points of this were that we're in a new era, that the future really depends a lot on what they call the Greater Eurasian Partnership, which they both are devoted to. There's a redistribution of power going on, but they say that some actors, and of course we know who they mean by that, some actors representing just the minority of humanity are pursuing unilateral approaches, resorting to force, interfering in the affairs of other states, and they mean, of course, the United States and NATO. On democracy, they claim that no size fits all, different civilizations move to democracy in a different pace and in different ways. This, of course, is all an excuse for their very authoritarian systems. They say that these democratic principles should be applied to at the global level as well, and no one state should set the democratic standards. It's more complicated than that, they claim. And so they're supporting each other. Russia now supports the One China policy on Taiwan. Xi Jinping now is opposed to further NATO expansion, which he was not before. He didn't just ignore that issue. And they are cooperating now in space, a joint space program. The space station in the U.S. cooperation in space is coming to an end. And for the future now, Russia and China are going to cooperate on moon landings and further into space. They're merging their GPS systems for use around the world. And by the way, their system is more accurate than ours. And it's a matter of a few meters, but still. Obviously, Russia is looking. China could consume all of Russia's oil and gas, 100% of it. The question is how long it takes if Russia goes this route to reorient the pipelines. They claim that their friendship has no limits and there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. So how far will China go in supporting Russia in this? That's the question Washington is asking. And tomorrow, Biden will have a virtual quote unquote summit with Xi Jinping, hastily arranged because there are reports that China is willing to provide weaponry to Russia in this current situation. So I think this cartoon kind of sums it up. How far is Xi willing to go in support of the junior partner now, Russia? And I'm going to quickly go through this. Now I'm going a little bit long. I'm going to try to wrap this up here. U.S. policy is a part of this to some extent. In 2016, 2017, we rolled out our new national security strategy. And this is James Mattis announcing it. And the basic point in that strategy is we made a huge mistake after 9/11. We've been on a fool's errand for decades. This is said straight out. It was a mistake to go into the Middle East the way we did after 9/11. It weakened us, it weakened our military, and it caused us to take our eye off the ball of the trend of the era, which was the emergence of China and the reemergence of Russia, and that going forward, our national security depends on confronting and containing great powers that are out to undo what we call the rules-based order. If I were, and I have students at the U, who come as untraditional students, having served 3-4 times in Iraq or Afghanistan, I mean, to have gone through that and then hear what the official U.S. policy is now on that, I would think would be very dispiriting. And in addition, now with Biden, the idea now is we define the era as one of autocracy versus democracy. Human rights are a key part of this. We want to galvanize the world democracies. We don't buy the Russian-China idea that there's many kinds of democracy and different civilizations and all that sort of thing. We believe that there is either democracy or not. And so I think that this shift explains our hasty, well, it's not hasty after 20 years, but I mean, somewhat disheveled, shall we say, exit from Afghanistan. We made a fateful decision after 9/11 by going in. Colin Powell at the time said we should leave the Taliban in place, go after al-Qaeda, but we have to work with Pakistan and the Taliban. We really can't win a civil war against them. But Cheney and Rumsfeld were for going all the way in. And as I say, everyone agrees now that it was a horrendous mistake. Now, both Jake Sullivan and our own Jake Sullivan from Southwest High School and Tony Blinken have been severely attacked by the Republicans, calls for their resignation. Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley have held up ambassadorial appointments in the Senate. Very few have been approved, demanding the resignations. And so I think that the Biden team sees Ukraine as a way to rehabilitate its foreign policy. I think they're doing a fairly good job so far. Unfortunately, both Jake and Tony Blinken are seen in Washington quite broadly as staffers. They came up as staffers to Biden, and some people wonder whether they really have the background for the kind of positions they're in now, as opposed to being in-house staffers. So I'm agnostic about that. I do know that Jake is a very, very intelligent guy, extremely intelligent. So so this new security strategy is causing now, under the Biden team, some new developments that are pretty important. We look to the first island chain, that first row of dots, where are Taiwan and Hong Kong, of course, South China Sea, wanting to prevent China from gaining the upper hand there. The basic strategy of the U.S. in World War II and since World War II has been to prevent the rise of what we call a regional hegemon or a peer competitor in Asia or in Europe. We are a hegemon in our own region. That's what allows us to project power, and we don't want any other great power to have that luxury. And so for us, Ukraine and Taiwan are seen as ways to prevent the emergence of these two countries. The idea that if they do control these proxy areas, they become more formidable opponents. And that is somewhat in the background here. So Taiwan especially, we've been increasing our sort of overflights, aircraft carriers coming in toward Taiwan. And a very important thing happened just a month and a half ago when testifying before the Senate, Eli Ratner, Assistant Secretary of Defense, said that Taiwan now is critical to the defense of vital U.S. interests. It's a critical node in the first island chain. Now, this means we don't want Taiwan to become part of China. We're saying it straight out. It's a vital U.S. national interest that it remain a critical node. This is deviating from the one China policy, where we've used what they call strategic ambiguity on this issue. This is a clear deviation, and Biden has, in his own way, said the same thing. The Chinese are all ears to this. At the same time, we did something similar. In September, Biden and Zelensky announced a new charter of partnership between our two countries. It's called the U.S.-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership, in which we said that Ukraine joining the West is a vital U.S. security interest, and that we would, under what's called the Enhanced Opportunities Partner Program, continue to arm Ukraine. So this, in a way, went beyond NATO's pronouncements. The U.S. bilateral statement on Ukraine made it pretty clear that Ukraine will join NATO. And it's interesting that the Russians began to mobilize 2 days after the announcement of this charter. And here you can see some of the key aspects of it. This kind of thing goes totally unreported in the media, but our shifts in policy on Taiwan and Ukraine are at least some element in what's going on. So Russia and China see themselves as having a similar concern, that the U.S. is trying to prevent their rise in their regions, and so they're teaming up. This would happen historically. And so here's some of the cooperation going on in the Belt and Road. This turn to the east by Russia, they're getting fully involved. The fact that the northern seas are melting and will allow sea commerce across northern Eurasia is a big part of this, in addition to oil and gas. Washington is really worried that these three countries may begin to team up. We've left Central Asia now. We're out of Afghanistan, which is coming under the influence of China and Pakistan primarily, with Russia up there too. Central Asia, Russia and China are cooperating in Central Asia. There are two large blocks of alliances that went in to stabilize. This one, CSTO, when there were uprisings in Kazakhstan a few months ago, went in with peacekeepers from all those countries, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, founded by China and Russia in 2001, now includes Iran and potentially Turkey, also kind of a peacekeeping, quote unquote, operation in Central Asia. So total cooperation right now between China and Russia in this region. China rather, now is taking a very important step. They see what we're doing in Ukraine as a precursor to what we may do on Taiwan. In other words, mobilize the world, cut off the Chinese economy. If they were ever to try anything on Taiwan, I think the chances of China invading Taiwan are less likely now. And they won't, in the aftermath of this, they're going to reconsider a lot of things. But they have concluded that they have to have more strategic parity with us. Up until now, they've had what's called minimum deterrence in their nuclear weapons. You can see here China has almost no deployed warheads, and compared to Russia and the US has very few. Well, they now, and this is a CIA report, they haven't announced this, but it appears that they're going to increase their nuclear stockpile from 272 to about 1,000 by 2030, which is a major increase. It still is less than what we have and the Russians have, but you'll be hearing a lot about this in the media as a China buildup, nuclear buildup. And here you can see the silos where they're being developed out in Xinjiang. The other aspect to this is a new kind of weapon, the hypersonic weapon. China and Russia are ahead of us on this. The Pentagon spoke of a near Sputnik moment a few weeks ago when China did a test with what's called the fractional orbital bombardment system. This is hypersonic, flying at low altitudes. This missile went around the world in the other direction and came and did the strike. Russia has the Zircon missile, which they're threatening us with if the Ukraine situation gets any worse. You can see here the problem. These hypersonic weapons go very low. Now, very final, very final. I'm cramming a lot in here, but I'm trying to give as much background as possible here. What will the Chinese do? They're worried about the U.S. policy on Taiwan. They see what's happening to Russia. They are, for their own reasons, cracking down at home. Xi Jinping and the Russian leadership have decided that inequality is a threat to social stability worldwide. They think that with globalization and the new technologies, this inequality is happening everywhere, and they want to get a handle on it. So they're clipping the wings of people like Jack Ma. They are pursuing a policy of what they call common prosperity, what we will call social engineering and economic engineering. They believe that the United States will eventually face upheaval because of our inequalities, and I hope they're wrong, but anyway, it's interesting they're taking these different approaches. But they've also cracked down on Bitcoin. A lot of the Bitcoin farms used to be in China because China wants its own national digital currency run by the government. Of course, that'll allow them to monitor the population more, but they're even more motivated now because of what's happening in Ukraine. They see what happened to Russia, what happened to their central bank. And I'll just read you a report that came out earlier this week from Credit Suisse, which is a very conservative, if you will, bank. But here's what they wrote. They said the central bank freeze against Russia's central bank marks the death of the post-Bretton Woods system, which was born after Richard Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard in 1971. And up until 1971, the dollar was linked to gold. There was a there. Ever since 71, it's just the full faith and confidence in the dollar, which has allowed us to do pretty much anything we want as long as it's the reserve currency in the world. And so Credit Suisse says that, no, we're going to start moving now. This is a watershed, what the U.S. has done with these sanctions, and that the new monetary order will be centered around commodity-based currencies in the East. Combination of China's national digital currency and maybe resources, including from Russia. As Credit Suisse writes, if your dollars can vanish at the will of the issuer, the logic runs that then a reserve must exist outside the dollar-based financial system. Only by becoming an issuer rather than a holder of reserves can Beijing wrest some of America's financial power to itself. And they say that at a minimum, there'll be a fragmentation going forward. So you see here, these are the blocks that are forming around the world today. And I'm concluding now that it's just tragic that at a time when we're facing these global threats, pandemics and climate, all the things that are going to require close cooperation among large countries, it's tragic to see things going in the direction they're going. It's a human rights catastrophe. And we just have to hope that reason will prevail here. There's an excellent book written about World War I called The Sleepwalkers, which shows how, in a way, the world went sleepwalking. And one final thing, John Kennedy, who stared into the face, nuclear Armageddon in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it severely shook him. He gave a speech months after that, and just a few months before his assassination. It was a famous speech at American University on June 10th, 1963. And he said the following. He said, "So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct our attention to our common interests and to the means by which these differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we are all inhabitants of this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." Kennedy, had he lived, probably would have taken very different policies than the U.S. took. As I say, this was right after he saw a near nuclear war. And I just hope that cooler heads will prevail and that our priorities globally on threats facing us will finally come to a reasonable state. So I'll stop there. Went on too long, of course, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Thomas. It was wonderful. Well, I think I'm going to ask the first question for you.
Yes.
Well, we know that we have most of the international laws depend on or rely on volition of the governments to comply.
Mm-hmm.
So as of today, there are few international pacts that Russia is signatory. For example, the Geneva Convention. And just yesterday, we learned that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, determined, and I decided, and I quote, that the invasion is illegal and that Russia should suspend military operations in Ukraine. Of course, it's
yes.
a longer decision. And the only two judges that voted against was the Russian and another one. Well, so what are the consequences of violation of the international laws, keeping that in
yes.
that we know?
Yes, well, I mean, as I'm sure you've seen, President Biden now has accused Putin personally of war crimes. And the United States will definitely push for war crimes investigations coming out of this terrible invasion. So that's a UN norm, if you will. It's an international law. The problem is, with the UN, as important as it is, the problem is this. If you look at the Security Council and at the UN General Assembly, the Security Council was conceived by FDR, right, as he set it up, to be based on what he called the four policemen. The four original members of the Security Council. Of course, France was added later at the behest of the British. The idea was that these policemen all had spheres of influence in the world, and that therefore they would be this body, that would try to mitigate crises in consultation. It basically accepted the idea of spheres of influence. The UNGA, a General Assembly, is based on the notion of sovereign individual nations. It's based on Westphalia. And so this contradiction has been built into the UN from the very beginning. And the problem is that the members of the Security Council can thwart attempts in the UN, at least, to apply international law. And of course, as you know, as a great power, we also, when it's convenient for us, we ignore International Court of Justice or other bodies like this. That's the unfortunate nature of power in the world. And as I say, it's built into the UN. It's interesting that the Russians and the Chinese in this joint statement take umbrage at the very idea of a rules-based order. They say the rules-based order is merely a cover for U.S. national interests because it is the U.S. that is promoting and defending this. What they say is they look to the UN Charter, right? They say for us, that's the world order. And of course, there they very conveniently cherry pick, and they say, the UN Charter, sovereignty of nations, non-interference in internal affairs. So stop interfering in our affairs, right? In other words, so the Chinese, they consider Taiwan an internal issue, and they evoke the UN Charter of all things in opposing, in spite of all the human rights abuses and everything else. So, Russia is flaunting international law. They have invaded a sovereign nation. They're committing tremendous human rights abuses. And I think the one area where they potentially will be called to task will be on war crimes. Question, how could we ever get at Putin in that regard? But that's the one area I think that something will actually be done.
Mm-hmm. We have 2 questions from the audience. Anne is asking, current negotiations between Ukraine and Russia have covered several exit scenarios.
Yes.
With Putin's need to have a win, what do you see as any probably exit scenarios, and is there any that would leave Ukraine intact?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think for the moment, the Russians are cynically, they're talking to Ukraine in a sense, they're buying time, because it's hard to know whether their invasion is stalled or whether from the beginning they plan to have a siege operation. It was rather than sending troops in and risking troops in urban warfare, which is a horrendous prospect, just encircle cities and then pound them. In which case their invasion is not stalled. It is slowly grinding down Ukraine, which is a tragic prospect where a lot of civilian casualties in that. So I think that the Russians right now are not negotiating in good faith. What some people see as a possible exit strategy would be some form of Ukrainian neutrality. And Zelensky, he is frustrated with NATO and frustrated with the US, as came out in his speech to our Congress. He said recently, I've given up on NATO. I know that they'll never defend us, and therefore I'm taking a different approach. And in that regard, he mentioned the word neutrality. In other words, if Ukraine can be given assurances, say by the UN, by the US, by Russia, that they will, if they don't join an alliance, they will not be undermined or attacked. And the problem is, they had that kind of agreement in the early 90s with the Budapest Memorandum, which they gave up the nuclear weapons that were on their soil after the Soviet Union collapsed. Under our pressure, they gave up those weapons. We didn't want proliferation, and got quote unquote guarantees. But I was in those negotiations, and I remember how the Russians insisted that we not use the word guarantee, rather use the word assurances, which is a weaker term. And already then you could see that this was going to be fungible from their point of view. And of course, that's what's turned out to happen. So the off-ramp could, now for years, in fact, since the 90s, people like Kissinger and others have used as a model for Ukraine the Austria Treaty of 1955. Now, people forget that after World War II, it wasn't just Germany that was occupied by the 4 victorious power. It wasn't just Berlin that was divided into 4 sectors. Vienna was too. And Austria was divided into 4 sectors. The film The Third Man, Orson Welles, which was voted the best movie in British history by the British film industry, is set in quadripartite Vienna. That's part of the plot. But in 1955, Khrushchev and Eisenhower at one of their summits decided that it would make sense for everyone to pull back, make Austria neutral in terms of its military alliances, but able to trade with anybody they want. So for Kissinger, the idea is that you would allow Ukraine to trade with everyone. They could become a bridge between East and West, but just not join any alliance. Whether we could go back to that is hard to say. Whether the Ukrainians would accept that. I mean, I think that after all they've gone through, they want to be members of NATO, especially the Western Ukrainians. I think it's in fact, if Zelensky tried to negotiate neutrality, he might find opposition at home. on this. But so how could this happen? Well, so Crimea. Russia doesn't want to give back Crimea. So could there be a UN-sponsored referendum to let the people of Crimea actually vote in a real referendum to see what they want to do? Could the Donbass become part of a highly federated Ukraine following an agreement? So what you'd have would be Ukraine intact except for Crimea after the referendum, or if they vote to stay in Ukraine, then and then an internationally backed treaty of neutrality for Ukraine, and they can join the EU or they can join the Eastern Union there. Like I say, we're very far from that, but at least the fact that they're even talking about that, and that probably is the most likely off-ramp. The alternative would be a grinding war of insurgency. And I know that there are some people in Washington that prefer that because they believe that if the war drags on, Russia will crack, that there'll be regime change of some kind in Russia if we just keep the pressure on. But that's going to mean a lot of Ukrainian lives. I mean, in a way, we'd be fighting to the last Ukrainian. And is that fair? So there are off-ramps, but from what you hear both from Zelensky and in Washington, neutrality for Ukraine might be part of it.
I have 2 more questions here. What do you make of China's support for Ukraine without condemning Russia? And would you comment on Russians who are protesting against Putin in the war?
Yes, and more power to them because they're taking a lot of risks. So China is straddling. Boy, I mean, this is an acrobatic act. On the one hand, they want to support Russia because they see what we're doing to what's happening to Russia right now as what will happen to them at some point on Taiwan, right? They see this as like a dry run, whether they're right or not. And they feel that there are strong interests between Russia and China on this. On the other hand, China has always supported the sovereignty of individual nations, right, as part of their Westphalian outlook. And so they've always been for Ukrainian sovereignty. And they have very good relations with Ukraine. They buy a lot of grain from Ukraine. They buy machinery from Ukraine. There's actually very important relations between Ukraine and Russia. So how to balance this out is so difficult for them, and especially since the invasion has not gone as well. I can imagine that Putin told Xi in their summit that this won't take that long. It'll be easy, and it's indicative that the head of the FSB or KGB Foreign Intelligence Service has been put under house arrest because he's the one who would have told Putin about the state of affairs in Ukraine before the invasion, and of course he's turning out to be totally wrong on that. So the Chinese are really in bad shape, and so the fateful decision is going to come right in the next days. There are ways that China can support Ukraine economically. They hold some of their debt and they can make it available to them. They can buy much more gas and oil and grain, which they said they will do. But reportedly, Russia's asking for military assistance. They're asking for drones, other kinds of things. And the US is warning China, saying, if you do this, there will be extremely significant sanctions on you. You know, we have something passed by the Congress called the CATSA. It's the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. And this is what allows us to apply secondary sanctions on any country that violates our primary sanctions. And we've applied them against EU members in the past, Germany, for example. I mean, so we're threatening China with severe sanctions, and China has begun threatening us back, saying that if we do that, they will respond in kind. So once again, if China decides to go that route and support Ukraine in that way, we'll have a further fragmentation of the global economy and further disruptions. That's why Biden is going to meet with Putin. So Jake Sullivan, our own Jake Sullivan, met with the Chinese counterpart in Rome this week. and basically warned them. Apparently the meeting went very badly, with Jake threatening sanctions and the Russians shooting back, or the Chinese shooting back at them. So whether Biden goes into this meeting with more threats to Xi, or whether there's something worked out, I don't know. But anyway, so this could take some new twists and turns. In terms of the people protesting, as I say, it tends to be younger Russians. The problem is that, because of the chaos in the 90s in Russia, the birth rate collapsed. And so these young generations are very small right now, very, very small compared to the overall population. And that's why Putin keeps these strong numbers, because older Russians support him. I'll make one more, just in terms of what China will do in this confrontation. One interesting thing is that we talk about how the world has come together on these sanctions. That's really not the case. It's the Western world that's come together, and Japan. So, the US, UK, Canada, South Korea, Japan, Australia, the Anglosphere, as they would call it, and of course the EU are all on board. But the countries that are not on board for these sanctions are China, India, Brazil, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, almost all of Latin America, including Mexico, Middle East. The Saudis won't even return Biden's phone calls, for example. Nor will the UAE. Israel is not going along with the sanctions and trying to be a mediator. So some analysts now are saying this is going to get interesting, because during the Cold War, you had a very active non-aligned movement that was very organized. And we could be seeing the emergence of a new non-aligned movement as this China-US, China-Russia-US confrontation increases. Because, pace what you hear on our media about this unified world, if you look more closely, it's much more complicated.
Thank you. We have another question from Fred. Could you comment on the strategic significance, if any, of Brazil's Bolsonaro meeting with Putin 1 week before Russia's invasion? Was it for potential food supply?
You can't rule that out. There's a bromance between Bolsonaro and Putin, just as there was between Trump and Putin, very unfortunately. And Brazil is in that.
And Bolsonaro.
And so it's like a triangle, right? And so you certainly can't rule that out. I can imagine that Putin would feel close enough or confident enough in Bolsonaro that he might have given him a heads up to what was coming. Although there are many reports that the Chinese were not fully informed that it was going to be this kind of an invasion. I don't, you don't know for sure what to believe, and whether it might have been just saying, okay, this is going to get complicated, and we would like to be able to either sell or purchase materials from you, because they've got to get around these sanctions somehow. But now this, of course, opens up the possibility of the U.S. Heavily sanctioning Brazil, which would, and now how that would play into the presidential campaign, first of all, in Brazil, what position Lula would take vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis the sanctions will be very interesting to see. I think it's going to be an issue in the Brazilian election coming forward. But yes, Russia is looking for any country. You may have noticed in the JCPOA Iran nuclear deal negotiations, Russia has blocked the agreement, insisting that they be given a pass on sanctions there, that they be allowed to trade freely with Iran within the JCPOA, in other words, circumventing the sanctions. And apparently the US is giving them a green light, because we really want that JCPOA badly. And because, getting more Iranian oil into the world market would be a plus for us right now in terms of the price.
And this is going to be our last question to you. No-fly zone. President Zelensky has been begging for a no-fly zone. Can you, if you can, explain to us in English?
Yes.
What does that mean to Ukraine, to Russia, and for the rest of us, the rest of the world? And why is there a reluctance to determine or to decree a no-fly zone until now?
Well, there's a number of things going on here. I mean, you can certainly, when you see these heartrending images of the human rights violations and just individual tragedies happening in Ukraine right now, I mean, you just, your instinct is to say, let's put a stop to this any way we can. And the idea is that, you know, Russia is striking from the air, and therefore a no-fly zone would be a way to do this. The logical problem with that is that Russia is not using fixed-wing aircraft to like bomb Ukraine because they don't control the airspace right now. And so these terrible attacks on civilian areas and elsewhere are coming, as I mentioned before, from land-based missiles and from bombers over Russian territory. So actually, in that scenario, it would make more sense to do what we're doing, which is to send these Soviet-era S-300 anti-aircraft or anti-missile defense systems in, and I think we're going to do that, which could try to knock out some of these missiles as they're coming in. So that's the one issue is that would a no-fly zone really change the situation? And so a lot of people think it would not. Secondly, though, you know, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It wants to be badly, and NATO would like it to be a member, but it's not right now. There's never been a consensus in NATO to bring them in. As a result, they do not have Article 5 guarantees, and we can't act as if they do, or else there's no distinction in NATO membership. So we can go very far in protecting them, but to take a step that would risk a direct confrontation with Russia, a military power, there's no consensus in NATO to do that. I mean, that it's not just Biden, it's in NATO. People just recoil from that because there is a danger of nuclear escalation. There always is, especially given Putin's mindset. And you could imagine shooting down a Russian plane with deaths, and then the Russians escalate. They attack a NATO installation in Poland because they've been attacked by NATO, and it then starts to escalate. They use tactical nuclear weapons, which you can't rule out, and it goes on from there. And one thing, I guess I'm old enough to remember the Cold War and how aware people were of the nuclear threat. I mean, it was, remember the film The Day After, and it was in the culture, and nuclear arms control was like a daily subject. And since the 90s, the new generations coming up, it's been silence on this issue. It's as if it all went away. There's nothing about it in the media. So it's like you see people almost like kind of blinking awake right now at the idea that there could be some kind of nuclear issue here. And it's because we're simply no longer focusing on that. And I think we have to get back to the concern. And frankly, I think a key human rights issue is arms control. I think that human rights organizations ought to be joining with the MacArthur Foundation and others who are lamenting the fact that arms control has fallen off the agenda, lamenting the fact that nobody's aware of the nuclear risks anymore. I mean, to have members of Congress calling for this no-fly zone shows how much this issue has just vanished. And it shouldn't, because it's still there. And there's a huge arms race going on now. In fact, this is, I think, an important point that we have to watch. I mentioned these hypersonic weapons, which it's a whole new kind of weapon that's going to be very destabilizing. Tactical weapons. We are developing something called dial-a-yield tactical weapons. We also are developing these warfighting small weapons where you can gauge in the Cold War, those would have been seen as lowering the nuclear threshold, as they used to say, right? Making nuclear conflict more likely. It's just happening with no comment. The media, New York Times, I mean, nobody is saying anything about this. Somebody's got to call this to people's attention. And then you add to that artificial intelligence weapons, AI, where we are already turning over battlefield decisions to AI. That's happening right now. And there's a book out I recommend about the AI future by, it's Kissinger, but also Eric Schmidt of Google and a fellow at MIT. describing the AI future and what it means in different areas. And Kissinger writes about what's happening, and he says, with nuclear weapons, it was possible to conceive of principles of deterrence in which there was some symmetry between the damage on each side. And that's why the Chinese now are ramping up. They want to get back to mad, right? So that's why they're doing this. But he writes, if an unrestrained US-China arms race goes from nuclear to AI, the dangers of dramatic escalation would be very great, because there wouldn't be such a thing as mutual assured destruction. That would disappear in his view. So he thinks we're in a period of great uncertainty and great peril. Once again, not a peep in the media about any of this. And so talk about sleepwalking. In my view, it's dangerous sleepwalking. And I think human rights organizations ought to raise this. I really do. Because talk about affecting human rights and survival. This is as important as it gets, in my view.
That's true. Thomas, thank you so much. It's so sad to let you go right now, because I feel there are so many other things that we still wanted to hear, but it's been a wonderful moment to hear you explaining everything. On behalf of CGS Minnesota, I want to thank you all for attending this event. If you want to watch this program again and others, the recording can be found on our website and our YouTube channel, along with resources to help. CGS Minnesota hosts events every month. Please visit our website to learn what the next events are. If you want to make a difference and you want to know how to assist, how you can assist, please contact us at www.globalsolutionsmn.org or send an email to cgsmn.contact@gmail.com. Thank you, Thomas Hanson, for accepting our invitation and for sharing with us the facts, the causes, the consequences, and responding to the questions about the war in Ukraine. And I leave you with our final thoughts and message and our biggest gratitude.
Katya, thank you so much. And thanks to your organization, and Godspeed in your work. It's more important than ever. So thank you again. Thank you again.
Thank you for your work. Thank you, and have a good night, everybody.